So right now then we're going to be graphing aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We're going to be making an analysis of aggregate demand and aggregate supply as it regards the business cycle, because it corresponds what we're talking about. And here's what I mean by that. So the aggregate demand graph starts with real GDP on the x-axis, the same label we see over here. We've studied real versus nominal, so you know that this means that this is adjusted for inflation. Over here, then, we're going to be placing price level, and then we're going to add what's called long-run aggregate supply. This stands for long-run aggregate supply. And so you have to know that long-run aggregate means all of the stuff, and supply, of course, is the supply curve. So from there, then, we're going to go ahead and add the aggregate demand graph. Aggregate demand means all. And then let's put in what's called the short-run aggregate supply. And so one of the key concepts that we're going to be looking at in this unit is long-run versus short-run. And we're going to be looking at the word aggregate constantly, because aggregate means all. Previously, when we graphed supply and demand, we would do something like corn or coffee and creamer. We were very specific to the actual market. Microecon does that. It looks at individual, micro with an I, it looks at individual with an I markets. Macroecon looks at the aggregate market. Macro with an A for aggregate, A for all. We're looking at the United States simultaneously right now. This represents the United States currently in what is called long-run equilibrium. And as a matter of fact, this spot right here is the United States economy in what's called long-run equilibrium. On the AP exam, you might get asked, draw the United States economy currently in long-run equilibrium. That's what this is. And they'll tell you what to label the intersect here on the x-axis. They might tell you to label it long-run equilibrium. They might tell you to label it full employment. They might tell you, in addition to these labels, they might tell you to label it the natural rate of output. Either way it goes, this spot right there in black represents where the economy ought to be. And this is called long-run equilibrium. Long-run aggregate supply represents the resources available to produce in the United States. And it will move slowly but surely over the course of time, because we do discover new resources. More people are born, so there's more labor. We create new capital, new factories, that sort of thing. This will move very slowly over the course of time. Short-run aggregate supply will also move, and aggregate demand will move, and these, of course, are called shifts. We're going to need to learn what causes these shifts. So aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply give us what this then is called the macroeconomic equilibrium. Just drawing this base graph on the AP exam will often get you 2 points. So you're going to want to make sure that you understand how to draw that graph. So real quick then, I'm going to draw another one. And this one, we're going to add a shift. And so I'm going to go long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply. And I'm going to label this right here Y1. Often that's what they're going to ask you to do. Here is our current price level. This is labeled price. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I just drew the United States economy in what is called long-run equilibrium. However, on the business cycle, we know that we aren't always stable. We know that things over the course of time fluctuate. And so the first thing I'm going to point out to you is that this spot right here on the business cycle is called a recession. We just went over that. And so over here on this graph, to show recession, all we need to do is add the following. This is the United States currently in a recession. No arrow required because it's not a shift. It's where we are. See, this spot right here represents what's called a short-run equilibrium. In black, there is a long-run equilibrium. So black is where we ought to be, and in red, that's currently where we are. I'm going to put PR for recession there. And then I'm going to do this, Y2. Now, what this shows us is that we are currently operating below full employment. We're currently operating below the natural rate of output. We're currently operating below long-run equilibrium. AP very often asks to draw this graph word for word right there for the long question on the macroeconomics test. So if you could draw the base graph, read what they're telling you to do, and then do this, you're in business. You're often going to get 4 points on the AP exam for that. This red dot represents a short run equilibrium. It's where we currently are. What you're going to learn in the remainder of the quarter as we go forward is we're going to be looking at fiscal policy. And this is how government uses its budget. And we're going to look at how fiscal policy is used to affect aggregate demand. Many of you have said, why can't the government just? Why can't the government just? Why can't the government just? Well, in this unit, we're going to see what the government will and can do to fix this. See, again, this is a recession. When we are in a recession, we want the government to try to help to fix it, and they will. So real quick then, what we want to make sure that we can list right now are our shifters of aggregate demand. The shifters of aggregate demand are C, I, G, and NX. And you'll need to be able to recite these, just like what we did with first semester with supply and demand, tribe, taste-related goods, income, buyers, expectations. You have to know shifters of aggregate demand. Aggregate means all, so what are the things that affect the total GDP in the United States? The answer is consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. These items then are what we call our shifters of demand. If any of these are below normal, we will fall into a recession. And then what we will learn as government will spend more or manipulate our consumption to push it back to where we ought to be. No error required here because it shows where we are versus where we ought to be. Very similar to externalities, if you recall. Very similar. So what I'm going to do now is show the opposite of this. This is what we call a recessionary gap. And so I'm going to now do the same thing, and I'm going to show you an inflationary gap. I'm just going to go ahead and use this graph to do that instead of redrawing it. Now, over here then, if we are expanding too fast, 0.4, then what you're going to see is aggregate demand flies off the grid kind of like this. Notice the new is parallel roughly to the old one. Here is our new short-run equilibrium. This is a short-run equilibrium because it's the intersect of short-run aggregate supply and demand. This is a long-run equilibrium because it's an intersect of short-run and long-run. And notice in this inflationary situation, I'm going to put PI there. Call this Y2. And notice in this inflationary gap situation that we are now operating above the long-run equilibrium. We're operating above full employment. We're operating above the natural rate of output. That means that that price is probably flying up a little bit in the United States, and that's why this is referred to as an inflationary gap. Now on the AP exam, if you're going to be able to draw this or this beyond the base graph, you're probably going to get 4 points on the long question. The long questions are usually worth 10 points, so you're going to get 4 out of 10 for being able to make these graphs happen. That means you're almost already to that magical 55%.